So I'm just old enough to have been around from the beginning of the time that policy started to address environmental issues and energy efficiency, renewable energy and all that sort of thing. I grew up in Cocoa Beach, which was right there by Cape Canaveral, and literally had rocket scientists for neighbors. And I actually designed a little solar car for the 7th grade science fair. So I feel like, even though I don't consider myself a historian, that I kind of embodies the history of some of the policy. And the problem with the issue policy has come up all during the morning. But I assure you, as a policy person, somebody spent all his life on that, there is way too much to talk about all day today, much less than an hour here. So I've asked each of the speakers to help us think beyond the obvious or the things that we're all aware of. You know, energy efficiency is a good thing, water conservation is a good thing, but where is the edge? First of all, are we doing enough? Is what we're doing today going to take us to a sustainable place? Is this satisfactory, or do we still need to go yet further and faster? And also, where is the edge today of where we're trying to move the ball forward? So with that, we're going to just jump right into this with Carla Nemeth, who is the Executive Director of the California Department of Water Resources.
That's right. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was instructed to speak a little slower and not try to jam everything in. So I thought I'd provide a very brief overview of the Department of Water Resources. It's a state agency that provides flood protection and owns and operates what's called the State Water Project. It also is the implementer of a newly passed law in California to manage our groundwater basins, which are severely depleted in some portions of the state, to manage them towards sustainability by the year 2040. We also play a really important role in providing funding and technical assistance to local water districts to support overall water supply resiliency. Those are things like desalination grants, recycled water, stormwater capture, other water use efficiencies. The department is also the implementer of a new open data legislation that passed last year, which for some folks I think can seem rather dry, but it's actually essential in California that we all start working off of publicly accessible data for how we manage water in California, and I think there are real opportunities there for some nexus with water and energy use and providing that data to the public. I can't emphasize enough, most of water in California is managed at the local level, and so those water districts are absolutely our partners in everything we do. We'd like to, at a minimum, argue about water in California. It has roots in its association with the water rights system, which is a very deeply held system in California that fuels a lot of our arguments over how best to use it. But I think one thing we all agree on in California is that we need to use it a lot more efficiently over the next several decades, and we need to do so in a way that is far more sensitive to energy consumption if California is going to meet its climate goals. The State Water Project, I want to focus on that for just a moment. It is the biggest state-built water infrastructure system in the country. It serves 27 million Californians, and it essentially moves water from the northeastern corner of the state to water users here in the Bay Area, down in Southern California, on the central coast of California, and in the Central Valley. We have 34 storage facilities, 700 miles of canals and pipelines. We have power generation plants, hydropower generation plants, And it really is a essential supply for a majority of Californians. It also supports the environment, ecosystems, in many different parts of the state, some of our wildlife refuges, and so forth. But that system is aging. Many of you, I think no matter where you're from, because it really became an international event, are probably aware that the biggest of our state reservoirs, Oroville, Lake Oroville, experienced an infrastructure failure in 2017. And we have 2 spillways, flood control spillways associated with that facility. And in the midst of a tremendous storm event, that infrastructure, piece of infrastructure started to fail. We evacuated 200,000 Californians. We were very, very, very fortunate that there was damage was limited to the facility and some of the surrounding areas, and there was no loss of human life. But it very much emphasizes what I think is an incredible opportunity for the department and really for our partners with industry. I described a pretty vast network of infrastructure pieces that make up the State Water Project. Typically, we have facilities that are manufactured expressly for the project. And we are headed into an era where we need to rehabilitate the canals and pipelines I mentioned, the storage systems. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity for the State Water Project to be an energy leader. Right now, about 65% of our energy sources are emissions-free. By 2045, we expect to have 100% of our energy sources be emissions-free. There's all sorts of things that we're looking at doing to help generate that, including bringing solar more fully into the State Water Project. And with some of our significant construction efforts, engaging in hybrid and electric vehicles that can help us, big tractor trailers that can help us during the construction process, but also embrace new innovations that can help us actually operate the system much more energy efficiently. Yes.
So most water is managed and distributed locally, though, so you're
Correct.
really kind of a wholesale.
Absolutely. We're a wholesaler to
operation,
wholesalers
right?
in many cases, yes.
So part of what the conference is trying to focus on is how do we get down to the customers with some of this message. Talk about your relationship to those local distribution companies. Are you helping them also with guidance on how to do better at conservation or engaging their own customers, or actually putting pressure on them in various ways, or are there requirements?
Yes and yes and yes. So one of the byproducts of the latest drought in California, which I think it made the papers today that California is drought-free for the first time since 2011, so almost a 10-year drought. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, don't get too happy.
Get
That's
too happy.
just a technical definition of how
Well,
many
it's coming
months
back.
you've been without
Yeah.
it. It's coming back.
It's
so,
coming
yeah.
back. So what do we do in these times of bounty? But one of the important effects of that drought was we passed water use efficiency legislation in California, and the department is an implementer of that, together with what's called a State Water Resources Control Board, which manages the water rights system in California and has delegated authorities under the Clean Water Act. So we actually implement the Clean Water Act here in California on behalf of essentially the federal government. So together we implement new rules for water use efficiency, and supporting new technologies that do that is going to be essential. So the department is both a technical assistance provider and a grant maker in that arena. We are looking at ways in which some of the critiques of the Department of Water Resources Agency is that, you know, we give a lot of grants and we're really great at doing that for 1980s technology, which is, you know, good feedback, but that's something that I want to change as director. And some of the things we're talking about are establishing an office of a chief technology officer that can really be the conduit from all of our different programs.
So you're exploring things
to
like
the university
AMI
system.
for water systems,
Absolutely.
for example, because they're a decade or more behind electric system in that regard.
Absolutely. There's also really important partnerships at the federal level. The department has been engaged in conversations with entities that are competing to establish an energy water lab. As you all may know, we have national labs in California, and the federal government is looking to establish hubs to get at that energy water nexus, and the department has been participating through funding and looking to fund over the series of the next 5 to 10 years with some sustained state contribution. And the chief reason for that is for the department to become a lot more familiar with some of these technologies, newer technologies, and be a conduit through all the water agencies that in turn come to us for funding to start to access some of those new technologies.
Exciting.
I'll stop there.
Stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Next time we're going to ask Drew Bohan, who is the Executive Director of the California Energy Commission, Sacramento-based, not the Public Utility Commission in the Bay Area here. And talk a little bit real quick just about the differentiation between the agencies so people know kind of what your role is.
Sure.
And then bring us your big idea for the day.
Okay, well, let me start by saying thank you, Bob, and all the Smart Energy Water folks who helped put this together. Very helpful. Looks like my mic's not working. Is it working now? Yes. Okay, thanks. I've got 2 mics just in case. So the Public Utilities Commission, located in San Francisco, sets rates. They do a lot of things, but in energy, the principal task they have is to manage the 3 largest electricity utilities in the state, which are collectively about 75% of all the electricity consumed in the state. These 3 very large utilities manage, and the Public Utilities Commission manages them. We do a whole range of things, and my big idea today is neither new nor particularly innovative, but I think it's got a lot of promise still, a lot more we can extract out of it, and that is efficiency, both on the water side and on the electricity side. So I want to take a little step back, though, and talk about Senate Bill 100. Senate Bill 100 is probably something you don't know about if you're not from California. You might not know even if you are from California, but it was a bill signed last year by Governor Brown in September, and it's aptly named because it directs us to be zero carbon electricity by 2045. So in 25 years, we've got to get to zero. Sounds ambitious, sounds to some people a little crazy, but 10 years ago we were at 12% renewable electricity in California. Just last year, 10 years later, we hit 34%. So some of the same folks that were saying in 2008, this is impossible, likely are the same that are saying so is 100%, but I think we're actually well on track to meet that. This is due to the way our system is designed, does not include large hydro, coincidentally, since we're talking about water. In a poor water year, we get about 6% of our electricity in California from hydro. In a good year, we get about 15%. So if you take a good year, this year's looking like it's going to be a good year, add it to the 34, we're about half right now, and we're going to have to figure out what actually counts towards the 100% goal. But the Energy Commission, our Air Resources Board, and who's principally in charge of our large state climate efforts, and the Public Utilities Commission are all jointly tasked to come up with a plan. How are we going to get there in 25 years to 100% zero carbon electricity? So we're working on that now, and we've got a lot of tools. We've got renewables, we've got demand response, we've got electric vehicles, we've got storage, of which electric vehicles can play a part. We've got a number of things, but one of them is efficiency. And so what I wanted to do today is, I think someone, and I'm not sure where the clicker is, there's the slide I was going to show. And unlike Carla, who's a better speaker than I have to rely on my notes, and I can cheat by looking at the screen here as well. Thank you. The Energy Commission adopts appliance and building standards among a number of things that we do. And this SB 100 is really our lodestar. This is how we're looking at a lot of what we do going forward, and how can our energy efficiency work contribute to this goal. If we have fewer kilowatts we need to produce because we're successful in efficiency, that means it's going to be that much easier to get to 100% clean energy. So this is a look at a regulation we adopted in 2015, and it regulated faucets and toilets and urinals. And you think, well, what could that possibly do in terms of savings? You know, how much do they really use? And so this slide shows the total use at 443 billion gallons, 2015 numbers, of water consumed by those devices. And once we have full turnover, which we estimate to be 2039, that is to say the shower head I have in my shower now, I'll probably put in a new one. When I do, it'll be one that meets these standards, will save pretty much just shy of a quarter of that water just by having lower flow devices. This doesn't include shower heads, which we adopted a little bit later in the year. So I want to just give you a couple GWIS stats on shower heads. And when you add it together, you get another 40 billion gallons of savings, again, when you get full turnover of all these devices. This saves 3,600 gigawatt hours per year of electricity. It's in the neighborhood of a little better than 1% of all electricity consumed in the state, and 513 million therms. This is mostly for natural gas fired water heating. It saves 3.5 million tons of CO2 and over $2 billion in savings to the consumer. And all of our building and appliance standards are, by law, required to be cost effective. So we impose these standards and have to figure out what's going to be the extra cost of a device that's built to be more efficient, factor that in, and if the cost to do that can't be retrieved by the user who has to buy those devices over the life of the device through water and energy savings, we lawfully can't do that. So these things end up being win-wins. They're good for California, and they're good for the consumers that get these devices. Just in terms of scale on water, we've done a calculation. There have been other studies done on this. I'm not sure there's a peer-reviewed study that gets down to the exact number, but about 20% of all electricity consumed in California is consumed by water. So it's moving water, as Carla talked about, downstate. Our Central Valley of California is kind of a basin shaped like this. From the north to the south, it's downhill. From the south to the north, it's downhill. And both river systems drain to the bay, where we are right now. And so as you go south with a lot of the water, you've got to go gently uphill until you reach a big mountain range, the Tehachapi Mountains. Then you got to get up over that range. Then you got to treat the water for most municipal uses. Then you have to treat it on the back end once it's been run down the piping system. And collectively, that adds up to a lot. It's also about 30% of natural gas usage in California in the residential and commercial sectors. That doesn't include industrial. So it's a big target for us.
What was the percentage of electricity?
About 20.
20%?
Yeah, give or take. Wow. And natural gas about 30, but I'll pull industrial out of that 30% figure. But the point is it's big. And so this is something we look at and say, wow, of all the things we could use our statutory tools to try to reduce, this is a really excellent target. We got another one. I'm going to move along. We've got another one we're working on right now for spray sprinkler bodies. Another 150 billion gallons a year for spray sprinkler bodies just by regulating the flow. And with all these things and with the other devices we regulate, like TVs and refrigerators and other more conventional appliances, the user doesn't see the difference. So there's no diminution in value in your television set that is using less energy or sprinklers that use less water. If you're finding you're not getting enough water with your sprinkler, and what our studies found is that most people do time. If you're not getting enough, you can just go more time and you can then get better usage. But we've modeled behavior and come up with the savings estimates based on that. Buildings, briefly, we also have an opportunity to save water and energy at the same time. So we require that your hot water pipes in California be insulated. So when you're running from your hot water heater, wherever it is in your house or business, to the place you're going to use it, the faucet, you got to insulate. This year, we adopt building standards every 3 years or so. We added another requirement that is optional, but you can get points. It's a system we have of different ways you can meet the standard. But if you elect to put your water heater close to your sources and thereby shorten the run, you can get a lot of points, and this is going to be very attractive to our builders. Quick numbers: single-family home will save somewhere near 1,000 gallons a year just from this one issue alone, and multifamily units about 300 gallons each. Real quick, heat pump water heaters is another area we're looking at because the energy usage for them can be lower, and we're trying to drive towards more and more electricity. And then finally, I just wanted to say one thing about our EPIC program, which is our energy research program. We invest about $150 million per year in energy research. It's not all about water, but in the last several years, we've invested about $65 million for 45 projects. They include, most recently, we just adopted one last week, and it was for an agricultural use that we expect will save, I believe it's 30 or 40% of the water to extract water out of fruit to make concentrates and that sort of thing. So we do the research that enables companies to try to save water and energy that way. And I think I'll close there, Bob.
By the way, I'd encourage anybody on the panel that wants to ask questions of other panel members. I think this would be more interesting, so feel free to jump in.
Right. So I'll just give my presentation first, and I'm probably guilty of the person with the most words on my slide, so go to the next slide. But I did want to ask Drew, so I don't forget, how are your water efficiency standards interrelated with EPA's WaterWise program? So I know probably everybody knows there's Energy Star out there. How many people know that there's a WaterWise program as well? Okay, that's pretty good. I mean, so I'm Bevan Bucheister, and I lead the Water Policy Learning Network. Actually, I'm Mike, so I don't think I need this. I lead the Water Policy and Learning Network for the National Governors Association. So we work with all the governors. We're nonpartisan, and we bring them the best ideas to advance policy, programs, funding for the goals that they want to meet. And so I work all through the whole water spectrum, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, ag irrigation water, water scarcity, droughts, floods, anything that they're concerned about. So my level of knowledge on water energy is, about this deep, an inch or two deep. But I have done some retreats with some states on water energy because that was one of the goals that they wanted to reach. But when I'm talking to people from the electricity crowd, I just want to give you the scale issue in the water world. So this slide tells you there's 50,000 community water systems in the United States, and 4,000 of them are serving 80% of our population. So they're the bigger ones, the more advanced ones that can adopt new technology and have the capacity to do that. Then there's 15,000 wastewater plants, and compare that to 3,000 electricity providers. And it gives you a picture of the very, very small scale that most of the water utility providers operate on. So when I went and did a state retreat with Minnesota, and they told me, okay, there's this town that's 10,000 people, and here's their issue. And I said, oh, that's kind of a medium-sized town. Or I said, no, that's a small-sized town. And they kind of looked at me and went, no, that's a really kind of a larger-sized town in our state. A small town is 3,000 people. So they might have 2 people operating the wastewater and the water treatment plant. So, or they might have a part-time public works director who operates the water and the wastewater treatment plant. And I'm not, if you're familiar with EPA standards, you've got to test for 90 contaminants in drinking water. It's not like a part-time job. It's a serious job. People are ingesting this. And so go ahead to the next slide. So I just have some observations, some policy observations from doing those meetings with the states and figuring out what is in the way of technology adoption. Because like St. Cloud, Minnesota, they're doing all this amazing stuff, and they're adopting the most advanced technology, and they're creating energy, or, out of biogas. But so they were trying to figure out how do you spread this to the other smaller utilities, and what does the governor's office have to do with how can they make these things happen? So I think the most important, the big idea from my perspective is how governor's offices can help this happen is coordinate departments. So, I mean, departments, in the state, they operate in their little silos of excellence. The energy department doesn't talk to the water department. Even between water regulations, it's so spread out to different departments. It's
Water and wastewater are often
Department of
different.
Environment, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Ag, Department of Health. They're all spread out all over the place, and they all have their little component of water, and they don't get together and talk to each other. So, I mean, one of the most enlightening things that I heard at these retreats was when we got all these different people together, figuring out how we can make progress. I heard comments on the side going, well, we never really get together and talk to each other. So the progress of just having them in the room together, and we're only doing one-day retreats. I mean, it gets them to open up and say, okay, what is the barrier to us doing this? What is the real barrier? And then somebody from another department can go, like the barriers, like data, educating the local officials, because they're the ones that have to approve rate increases if you're going to adopt some technology. So some other department, like the Commerce Department, they have like green interns, so they can, they found out like, okay, well, we have a tool that we created that can go out and do energy assessments on wastewater treatment plants. But so who can we get to do this? Because that's a labor-intensive job. So we have these green interns every year, so let's get them to go out and do it. And also they created their own tool because the tool from the Department of Energy was created to apply to larger wastewater treatment plants. So most of them are very small, so it wasn't very useful. So Minnesota created their own tool for smaller treatment plants, and that's something that they're willing to share with other states as well. So coordinating between departments in states, and I think a lot of there's like 23 states now that are on the U.S. Climate Alliance. So a lot of them have climate committees or climate departments, and they're creating the climate plan. And I think California has the best acronym for theirs. It's called WETCAT. It's the Water Energy Team of the Climate Action Team. So I think you all win with the best acronym on that. But Governor Doug Ducey, he put together with his energy division, they're looking at water resources as well. So just that connection on that level where they get together and they talk to each other all the time and they find those connections, that's really important. And then encouraging partnerships, co-ops, consolidation of those 50,000 water utilities. That's really important, and passing policies to encourage that. And really, I think the state has the view of where they have these really small utilities that they're giving state revolving fund money to, but they're just kind of like, helping them along and putting Band-Aids on the real issues. So I think they have the overall broad view of, where these partnerships can be made. And I know I've talked to some states where they even have money, and they're talking to two towns that are close together, and they're small towns, and maybe their water's been cut off for 6 weeks because they have this problem, and they can't, it takes them a couple weeks to figure out what the problem is, and then it's a $20,000 fix, and then they come along with the money, and the state comes along with the money, and they have the two towns sitting together, and they've worked with them, and they've talked to give them all the good reasons why they should consolidate or partner. And then they get them to the table, and the towns go, and they have the money to do it. And they go, no, we don't want to do this anymore, because it's a political view of it's their sovereignty. Like if they don't own their water plant and their police force, they're not really a real town anymore. So I've talked to the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. They presented at some of our convenings with the water policy advisors, and they go out in the field, and they're funded by USDA, so they work in rural areas. And they work with local officials and local communities, and it takes them a really long time on the ground, you know, to sell this idea, to tell them how it's going to work, to help them figure out how they're going to mesh operations, or how they can just partner for administration and like procurement and things like that. And so it takes them a really long time, and they're not funded very well. So that's one of those education components that needs to happen to make these, you know, to coordinate and to get these, you know, utilities to partner so they can have the capacity to adopt this new technology. So one of my funders is American Water, and they're a private company, and they're all over the country. So they have that scale where they can have researchers, and they have procurement. And when, you know, when one state adopts a drinking water standard that's stricter than the federal government or stricter than other states, like we were talking about, you know, PFAS, the chemical from nonstick pans and nonstick or waterproofing and things like that. So that's getting into people's drinking water systems. And so they're looking at, you know, New Jersey's proposed a standard of 13, whereas the EPA health advisory is 70. So when American Water's looking at it.
So don't go too far into the weeds, because you're running out of time.
So they have the scale to say, okay, we're going to treat it to the most strict standard that anybody in the whole country is using. So it's just that scale thing that allows them to adopt new technology.
And clearly from your first slide, the scale thing is a big issue with 50,000 small water utilities. I would say one of the things Smart Energy Water is trying to do is create a tool for lots of small utilities. In other words, we want to be kind of the TurboTax of the utility business, be able to provide workforce coordination, logistics, and customer interface, and all those kind of things that you can just subscribe to, essentially. So creating tools that some of these folks maybe could afford to bring them along on some of these things. But let me ask, both you and Drew didn't really answer the question either. Is what you're seeing happen going to be enough? Are we falling behind? Do we need to, are we still looking for new innovations? It makes me think of the latest report on climate, that they're saying, well, you know, even everything we're doing, even if people were doing what they committed, it's not going to be enough. In fact, even clean energy is not enough. We have to find ways to take carbon out of the air or whatever. Same way for water efficiency, conservation, for energy, and so on. Are we going to reach sustainability at the rate we're going? Do we think about that? Or are we just doing the best we can and seeing how it goes? Or
I'm thinking about, like, with all the challenges that these 46,000 medium and small sized water utilities have. I mean, they're just barely doing enough to keep their head above water, no pun intended. Yeah. But you know, they're having a hard time meeting you know, the regulations of treating or testing for those 90 contaminants and meeting the permits, you know, and their effluent permits from the wastewater treatment plants. So so we are not doing nearly enough, and then they have just all these barriers to adopting technology. So, and I think also the data, we had talked about the data collection. So Wisconsin went out and they did an energy audit of like 50 of their wastewater treatment plants. And they gave that information to the wastewater treatment plants so they could compare themselves to the other ones in the state. They you know, left out the names of all the other ones, but they charted where they fell. But I think, like, spurring competition is very valuable. I mean, governors compete against each other to be the first and to do the best and doing the most, and so do, you know, towns and counties. And then spreading that technology is really important. And I think having good case studies from local regional areas. So a lot of states say to me, you know, like, well, we don't want to look at the states on either side of the coast because they're, you know, we want to see somebody close to us that's adopted that. So, and that's the same goes for counties. They want to hear, like, what the next county over has done first. And they are really risk averse. I mean, they have to meet permits. There's public health. People are ingesting this utility. I mean, it's the only utility that's ingested.
So Drew, you have something?
Well, I'll take the I'll take the eternal optimist position. I got asked to go to Tesla's unveiling of its new car last night, and Elon Musk spoke, and he pointed out that 11 years ago, Tesla had made one car. In fact, he said, there it is. And he had the very first car. He said, that's mine. And it was the very first car that he had made. They just got over 500,000 vehicles that they've manufactured, and they're expecting to manufacture another million additional ones, I believe he said, by year's end. So I see the trends going in all the right direction. I've got a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old, and it's what motivates me every morning when I wake up. The reason I pointed to efficiency is because the way I look at it, it's so easy. I mean, we don't think we have all the answers here in California by any means, but on appliances, it's pretty easy. So we've got a number of these different standards that are out there. We're obviously eager to share them with anyone who's interested. So they're pretty turnkey, at least some of them.
And the good news is a lot of people end up following what California starts. So those are all positive influences. But you just made a good segue for maybe a conversation with my friend John Wellinghoff, who has his own consulting practice now, but is a former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and before that a consumer advocate in the state of Nevada. John, utilities have taken a number of hits this morning, people pointing out that there's not enough innovation, that utilities don't tend to be innovative. But I will say one thing, in fairness, industries never really wanted utilities to be the ones doing the R&D and coming up with new IP, because they want to own that, right? The competitive companies want that in the competitive space or capitalist space. And regulators, frankly, have been reluctant to have utilities go spend high-risk money on developing new things. So it's not really fair to even criticize utilities a lot of ways for not being innovative, which is what brings us back to the policy conversation, right? But the innovation takes place in the private sector, and the question is, really, to get to where we need to be to even save the planet, we probably need to go beyond policy to innovation in the private sector. And part of the policy we need to be talking about is how to free that up, how to stimulate investment in the private sector, and what does it take to just remove barriers, and not in the sense of, Whitaker rolling back clean air emission requirements. I'm not talking about a backward-looking make America like it used to be kind of thing, but true innovation still in a positive direction.
Well, we need innovation now, Bobby, you're right. And this slide I have up here to provoke some thought, these people were responsible for more innovation in the electric sector than any other entity. They were also responsible for stopping more innovation than any other entity as well. So they,
gave us all a black eye in the process.
So it really is a two-edged sword. But policies go a long way, and policies are important. Policies can structure markets and can structure competitive fields that allow for us to improve efficiency substantially, not only in the energy field, but also in the water field as well. And I think, Bob, you said a good point at the beginning of this whole discussion, that I think the water industry is at least 10 years behind the electric industry, and the electric industry is 10 years behind where it would have been if these people, didn't screw it up for us all. We would have been much, much farther ahead. We would have had innovation, competition, and competitive structures for providing both retail and wholesale electric services throughout this country if Enron hadn't been in the picture. But literally dozens of states pulled their heads back in to their shells once this happened with Enron, including California. So because it happened, it put us very far behind. But if we can go to the next slide here, I can show you that there is some hope, and that's Texas, for example, did persist with innovation and did persist with competition, and they have a very robust electric competitive structure for retail electric services in Texas, as you well know, Bob, you live in the state. And so, it is possible to move through this sort of valley of death that either the monopolists and or the smartest guys in the room can stop us from going to, unfortunately. I think we can get there, but we need to move there quicker in the electric sector, and we need to move quicker in the water sector as well. And as part of that, what the electric sector has struggled with, and you mentioned being behind 10 years in the sense of, for example, smart meters, but only half the people in this country have smart meters in the electric sector. I don't think, what is it for on the water side? It's probably, 0.5% have smart meters on the water side. I mean, I have no idea what my water consumption is here, and I live in Berkeley, other than, what I get every 3 months from my PUD that provides me my water, East Bay water there. I really have no concept of how I'm using that water, in what ways throughout my house and garden in my residence, and really don't have the data. So we have to provide the data on one hand, and then the other side of it, we have to put the policies in place to allow for competitive structures so people can come in and help people become more efficient.
Right, and the data is one of my passions at this point, because I've worked with a lot of the folks that are trying to create smart homes and intelligent buildings and so on, but they have to have access to data, and especially for the mass market, they can't afford to put in sub-meters of their own. Demand responses really start in the commercial industrial sector because they can afford for big load to go out and put in their own meters. They're essentially having to run an end run around the failure of the utility industry to have the data available.
Right.
And we even have a national standard now called Green Button Standard, through which a customer can authenticate themselves online and authorize the transfer of data. In fact, the 3 IOUs here in California have had to adopt it. But what we're learning is the way we've adopted it is all wrong, because every utility having their own portal creates this crazy quilt work still of 3,000 portals around the country. Even if you assume the small ones will do it, which they won't, by the way. The 3 IOUs in California have already spent about $40 or $50 million on portals that there are a handful of companies that use. It's just, we're failing to create a kind of platform like, well, for instance, how many apps are there in the Apple App Store, right? That's because there is a single platform that operates the same for everybody all over the world. So developers step forward with innovation and innovate on that platform. So part of what we're heading toward and trying to build is a single data platform that every utility would be able to upload their data to, so that innovators could then build on that platform and reach customers across the country, maybe across the world. Anyway, so that's one of the big barriers right now.
And I think governments can help, enable those kinds of single platforms to come about. What FERC tried to do is enable that kind of single platform for the wholesale electric market. So we, in essence, have a single type of structure, an ISO, that is voluntary, unfortunately, and it should be mandatory across the U.S., but that's another whole long political discussion. But ultimately, that platform is defined and structured by FERC rules and regulations that allow any place in the country to set up that platform with an independent operator like you have in California here, that can operate that platform and allow for competitive services to be provided on the platform.
So we're running a little bit short on time, but actually I had one more thing I wanted to share, and then anybody else can do the same. And that was years ago, I worked for a guy named Fran Koster when I was at the Tennessee Valley Authority. I helped start the residential efficiency and renewable energy programs at TVA back in the late 70s. Show you how old I am. And Fran was somebody who had done research on how to reach customers and what makes a good warning. So if you are trying to warn American citizens or customers that we have global warming, that we need to save energy and so on, he said there are 3 elements to a good warning. He had a great presentation I wish I had a film of, but The first one is that everybody has to be able to understand what it is and relate to it in a personal way. And the second is that all the experts have to agree. And the third is there has to be individually implementable solutions. And a great example of this was if a fire begins in a theater and somebody just yells fire, there's chaos and people get hurt and trampled and, lost in the fire and so on. But if a manager knows about it, walks out in front of the audience and says, there's a small fire in the projector room, but it's not going to be a danger to you if you'll just follow instructions. So connecting it individually to them, I'm talking to you about something, fire, which you clearly understand is a problem. If you'll follow my instructions, we'll leave and be safe. And he's the expert and nobody's disagreeing. If somebody yelled out, oh, he's wrong, don't listen to him, right? Then you're back to chaos, which is kind of what our news, Fox versus CNN is today, right? The confusion. And the final step is individually implementable solutions. Wait until your row comes and we're going to exit one row at a time. Quickly, now go, next row go, and everybody gets out of the theater safe. So we almost, for me that just stuck for years because it seems so clear, and yet you watch commercials and things Department of Energy or others put out that are missing critical pieces of that, where you'll see something go, oh, that's really terrible, but at the end you're just left feeling terrible. There's not an individually implementable solution. And I think that's kind of a part of what this conference is about, is how do we take some of the things we're working on and move them down. Appliances, that makes it really easy. In fact, you mentioned Energy Star. 72% of Americans know what Energy Star is, and if you can create appliance standards and people can simply be pointed to those and know that they can do it. In fact, I think I read a Roper survey, I think we tweeted it today, 50% of people would like to do more, but they don't know what to do. They're not sure what to do. So Wood Mackenzie published research recently said that by 2023, there would be 88 gigawatts of flexibility in the power system just from connected home devices. But John, we've got to create some of these market structures and data availability for all that to contribute in a positive way, and we all are going to have to find ways to collaborate, like Shuli said earlier. But anyway, are we out of time?
We're out of time.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh, so Bob,
If we can thank all of our speakers, well, unless did somebody have something?
I just wanted to say, well, we were supposed to come up with an idea to activate the public, and I thought, with all these tech people here, somebody should create our water carbon footprint. And it'll be different for every state because, you said California is 30%. I mean, in Maryland, our water is really close and, it's like maybe 3%. So, and then tell them what they can do about it, because I know everybody wants to do something about climate change, and even this is hopeful. I'm not all depressing, but the more conservative states that we talked to, when we talked about water energy things that the more innovative states were doing, they said, oh, we're doing that too, but we're not couching it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We're just couching it in terms of cost savings. So get the message out to make it matter to them for what they care about, if it's cost savings or greenhouse gas emissions. But both of them are going to get to the same, the end goal.
I think we're getting the signal. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.